Good afternoon and welcome to a new episode of Africa Today, where we discuss the latest when it comes to African affairs. We start off the show in two segments. Firstly, we start off with a number of news reports in addition to the second segment, which is an interview. So let's start off with the reports where the Minister of Trade and Industry, Ahmed Samir, announced that the volume of trade exchange between Egypt and African countries amounted to $2.117 billion during the first quarter of 2023. Here's the story.
President spokesperson Ahmed Fahmy said that President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi spoke at the G20 summit not only as President of Egypt, but also representing Africa and developing countries in light of Egypt's presidency of new Partnership for Africa's Development, the NEPAD, and the Climate Conference COP27. He pointed out that with regard to the NEPAD file, Egypt shed light during the G20 summit on mobilizing funding for priority projects in Africa, including infrastructure projects, the development agenda, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, energy and food, along with the transition to the use of clean energy. The official spokesman added that President Sisi focused during the G20 summit on ways to provide financing for clean energy projects such as green hydrogen and ways to reform the global financial system and contain the defect in that system, noting that there is widespread international recognition of the necessity of reforming the defect in the global financial system, especially IMF and World Bank. Fahmy noted that President Sisi focused during the G20 summit on various issues of concern to developing countries in general and Africa in particular, especially with regards to the importance of strengthening international efforts to facilitate the integration of developing countries into the global economy in an equal manner. He explained that Egypt and the African continent share the same priorities such as infrastructure, future challenges, and a shared destiny, noting that when Egypt speaks in international forums, it takes into account the interests of the African continent.
Apologize for the mix-up there. That was a report about President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi calling for a comprehensive approach to tackle the global challenges during the opening session of the G20. And joining us over the phone to tell us more about the G20 summit and the African representation there is Ambassador Hussein Haridi, the former Assistant Foreign Minister. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Good afternoon, madam.
Sir, the 55-member bloc of the African nations joins the European Union as only the second regional organization to become permanent members of the G20. Can you tell us why is this significant and why is it important for the African continent?
Well, I guess the decision taken by the G20 summit in New Delhi 2 days ago to admit the African Union as a new member, that means that the member countries, the founding members of the G20, have come to realize and recognize that it's important to bring Africa into the G20.
Yes.
That's one explanation. Another explanation is that there is a fierce international competition among the superpowers and the great powers to have access to the natural resources, the rich natural resources available in Africa. It's being said that more than 40% of the world reserves of natural resources is in Africa. So we see this desire to have unhindered access on the part of the great powers to Africa. Thirdly, Africa needs major financial resources in order to deal with economic questions and to deal with the consequences of climate change. And the world powers have realized that, and I guess it all reflected in the admission of the African Union. On the other hand, I think that also there is a growing support for, in the context, of course, of the reform of the United Nations Security Council, that Africa should have a seat on the council. So
Yes.
these developments go to demonstrate how important is Africa in the future.
Mr. Ambassador, you spoke about the importance of the African continent when it comes to economic trade, specifically because of its natural resources that are available in the continent itself. But the African Union joining the G20 summit, how can this help benefit the economies of countries within the African continent itself? How could it be beneficial to be in direct contact with the G20 members?
Well, first of all, I would like to underline something. Being a member in the G20 in itself alone won't solve African problems. African problems will be solved by the people and the governments of Africa. And this is a precondition for any benefit in the future from the membership of the African Union in the G20. In other words, the member countries in the G20 would maybe in the future would offer enough financial resources, whether bilaterally or through the international economic and financial institutions, namely the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and other development banks. But, and there is a great but, it all depends, madam, it all depends on the policies adopted by African governments in the context of their agreed upon sustainable economic development, the Agenda 2063. So the main effort lies inside Africa. In absence of this main effort, in the absence of the rule of law, in absence of democracy, in absence of deep respect for human rights, that the membership of the African Union in G20 won't have the desired effect.
Sir, also attending the G20 was President Abdel Fattah Sisi, who gave a speech during the G20 talking about a shared momentum, I suppose, when it comes to the world challenges and the economic challenges facing the world in general. What are the most important aspects of this speech, do you believe, sir, when it comes to the sense of community around the world?
Well, I guess Egypt is in tune with with African voices, with the voices of the third world countries, what's now called the Global South, on laying foundation for fruitful cooperation between the Global South and the most industrialized countries, as well as with the major international economic and financial institutions. And of course, now, due to the fact that the challenges facing the world cannot be met by a single power or a group of countries, now I guess we are, like the American President Biden said, that we are at an inflection point in history. Of course, inflection point means that we badly need humanity, mankind badly needs international cooperation and not conflict. So I guess Egypt is in tune, as I said earlier, with the voices around the world for more cooperation to meet the challenges.
Sir, we spoke about the need for the African continent to also be part of a larger stage, specifically since many of the countries within the African continent are still developing. Um, and given that there are a lot of economic factors that affect this development, in addition to the climate change factor, do you believe that having the African Union within the G20 could somehow help push forward the African agenda when it comes to economic support and reform on a world stage?
Well, to a certain extent, of course, being at the seat of this G20 group would, of course, give a chance, the opportunity for African leaders and those responsible in the African Union to listen to the outside world.
Yes.
On the other hand, it would give them the chance also to speak on behalf of the African countries. Having said that, I guess both parties, the African Union, the African countries, and the world at large, know the problems and the problems of Africa, whether we are speaking about fighting terrorism, speaking about the women empowerment, about creating jobs for the growing youth population in Africa. I guess we all know the challenges. We all know where the problems are.
Yes.
The question, if there is a will to tackle these in the proper way. I guess a dialogue between Africa and the world at large, or a dialogue in the context of the G20 group between the two sides would help a lot in implementing agreed upon plans within the African Union on sustainable development, which is known as Agenda 2063. We are lagging behind. Africa is lagging behind. And we have to admit that.
Yes.
And in admitting that, we have to face the reasons.
Yes.
We have to tackle the reasons why we are lagging behind, why Africa is lagging behind in implementing the Agenda 2063 in all its elements. Let's take, for example, women empowerment. Let's take, for example, the job creation in Africa. So if we have the right answers to these questions, I guess we can safely that Africa would be on the right track, and that the membership of the African Union in the G20 would be beneficial for Africa.
Okay, Ambassador Hussein Hariri, the former Assistant Foreign Minister, thank you so much for joining us and highlighting the significance of G20 and the African Union. And thank you for joining us over the phone. We're going to move on with the rest of the reports of this episode, where the Minister of Trade and Industry, Ahmed Samir, announced that the volume of trade exchange between Egypt and African countries amounted to $2.117 billion during the first quarter of 2023. Here's the story.
Minister of Trade and Industry Ahmed Samir announced that the volume of trade exchange between Egypt and the African continent during the first quarter of this year is $2.117 billion, and that the most prominent 5 markets receiving Egyptian exports from the Black Continent is Libya, Sudan, Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, pointing out that the value of commodity exports Egypt for the African continent amounted to $1.611 billion, and that the value of Egyptian imports from the continent amounted to $506 million. Engineer Assam al-Naggar, chairman of the General Organization for Export and Import Control, said that the top 5 receiving markets for Egyptian exports, including Libya with a value of $317 million, Sudan with a value of 126, Algeria with a value of 217, Morocco with a value of 991, and Tunisia with a value of $86 million. He also explained that the most prominent sectors that formed the structure of Egyptian exports to the continent of Africa during the first quarter of this year included construction materials with a value of $422 million, chemical products and fertilizers with a value of $358 million, food industries with a value of $224 million, and engineering and electronic goods with a value of $185 million, medical industries with a value of $103 million, printing, packaging, paper, books, and artistic work with a value of $98 million, agricultural crops with a value of $80 million, spinning and textiles with a value of $47 million, furniture with a value of $24 million, furnishing with a value of $18 million, and ready-made garments with a value of $15 million, and handicrafts worth $14 million.
Well, this brings us to the end of this episode of Africa Today. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more here on Nile TV.